Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jeanfarish and I'm so glad that you're here with me. And before I forget, I want to ask you to subscribe if you like what you see. And if you hit that little bell icon, you'll also get notifications when there is anything new uploaded to my channel. So with that little business out of the way, let's talk about Sampler September or September Sampler, whichever way pleases you. I'm not really sure how this got started, but I know it's been going on for a couple of years. And people look at it in many different ways, and in my opinion, there's no right or wrong. I know that there's at least one shop that has kind of introduced a sampler for every day of the month. There are people who may want to start a sampler or a sampler-oriented project every day of the month of September. But I think for most people, it's a time to focus on a sampler that they've wanted to stitch, or maybe one that they've had in their whip pile for a while and have decided to get it out and change it from a work in progress to something that's finally finished. So a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned Sampler September and said, how about if we do a little bit of a stitch along? And a number of people are doing that, and that's with the Hare and the Basket. Now, this is a sampler that's been around for a while. It's what I call one of my vintage samplers. And just happen to have it right here. So those of you who attended Spirit of Cross Stitch might recognize it as the 1996 commemorative sampler for that event. But the verse is one that kind of, applies to just our love of samplers and our love of needlework and why we get so connected to it. So what I want to talk about today is how to particularly tackle this project, but much of what I'm going to say applies to almost any sampler and to many other non-sampler type cross-stitch projects. So I have uploaded and made public the stitching tutorials that I made when I taught this as a Zoom class. And let me address that while I'm thinking about it. So in these videos, which I will link in the comments, I am stitching with DMC flower thread. Now, flower thread is a wonderful stitching thread, I think, especially for samplers. What's nice about it is you can stitch with a single strand, and it has the weight of about 2 strands of floss. It has a slightly matte finish, so it's not as shiny as cotton floss. And so I really like it for samplers. So that's what this one is stitched with, the original from 1996. Now, since 1996, DMC stopped making flower thread. There's still a couple companies out there that make it. And if you can get your hands on it, I would really recommend that you give it a try. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, is that where I am stitching with a single strand of flower thread on a 28 count linen, you're going to want to stitch with 2 strands of floss. If you're stitching with like a 28, 30, 32 count linen. If you're stitching with something else, then the number of strands that you stitch with is all up to you. Now, the Hare and Basket can be stitched on Aida, and of course, any count Aida. But there are a couple of stitches that you'll have to adapt from the original, and I'll talk about that when the time comes. So the first tutorial really focuses on stitching the top border and one of the divider borders. And I'm not able to get my camera started. What's going on here? So as I was saying before I was interrupted by my camera not working, the first tutorial is talking about an easy way to stitch this kind of a border. And then it goes on to explain how to do the fishbone divider border. Also in that Well, I am just having all sorts of malfunctions today. How in the world did my necklace just come undone? I don't know. Whatever. So what was I saying? Oh, in the tutorial, since I'm using a single strand of flower thread, I need to use a waist knot, which I explain how to do that. If you're stitching with 2 strands of floss, you can use the loop method, and that always works with floss when you're using 2 strands. But whenever you do need to use a waist knot, that little tutorial may come in handy. Let's see. Also in the tutorial, I mentioned that you can start 3 inches down and 3 inches in. That is true if you have cut your fabric the appropriate size. Now, when I made that tutorial, it was for a specific class, and I had cut the fabric for everyone and mailed it to them. So I was confident in the stitch count. It's always a good idea to check and recheck your math, and it really isn't that hard. And I've explained how to do that in previous videos, and that may be something that I will kind of go over again at some point in time. I know so many people rely on stitch calculators, and they're great, but I think it's really important for a stitcher to have in their own personal tool belt what they need to know in order to stitch effectively and without the angst of, have I cut my fabric the right size? And I tell you, if you're stitching with linen, and even if you're stitching with Aida, it's an expensive part of what we do, and so why waste fabric? There's no sense in having a piece of fabric cut larger than you need, but it's a real disaster when it's too small. Let's see. Looking at my notes here. I think, so in stitching, approaching this, once you stitch that top border, let me look at my camera again for a second here, hoping it will work the first time this time. So I set up that tutorial with the idea that you'd be stitching this corner first. And once you do that and you stitch these flowers and leaves and vine, the thing that, unless you already know how to do it, the thing to leave empty is the center of the flower where the cross corner cushion stitch will go. That will be in the second tutorial. Stitch this divider border, and again, that Victorian cross stitch works beautifully for a straight line like this. And then once you get a couple of letters done, then you're ready for the fishbone stitch. If you also go ahead and get this row of stitches done, then the second lesson will include the herringbone stitch, which is this one right here. And so that will set you up perfectly for the next lesson. And you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait on me. I mean, the nice thing about this is you can stitch at your own pace, especially since I've already put the tutorials up there, so you don't need a code for them. They're set to be viewed by the public. So last week I got the pleasure of joining in a stitch gathering by way of Zoom that I had not attended before. This one was hosted by Kathleen, who's the owner of Salem Stitches. And during that Zoom gathering, somebody asked a question about the threads I used and wondered whether or not I was using any kind of an overdyed or variegated. Now, of course, in 1996, there were not, other than, the traditional variegated DMC, the whole idea of all the overdyes and stuff that we have available just were practically unheard of. So no, this one was not stitched in that way. But you can still get the same look of that sort of faded thing by alternating the shades of floss in one color family, which is basically what I did. So for example, the gradation of the alphabet letters, I go from dark to medium to light, back to medium to dark to medium to light. And so that's how I get kind of that faded look there. Now, one of the alternatives would be to cut your floss in a fairly short length. stitch until it runs out. And when it runs out, no matter where you are in the next letter, pick up the next shade. Now, again, this works when there's a very subtle gradation of colors. I'm not sure that it would work if there's a stark difference. So there are several shades of blue in this color family. And so I think that if you put to use all of them except for the navy blue, and then just go from one shade to the other, and when you get to the lightest shade, start working to the darkest. When you get the darkest, go back down to the lightest. There's probably some glare on this from the packaging, but you know, other than the navy blue, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shades of the same family of blues. So you can follow the chart just like it is, and I mean, personally, I think it'll turn out just fine because that's the way I designed it. But it would also be kind of interesting to see how it looks if you just use the blues, like I say, working from darkest to light, and then back again from light to dark, just across that line of alphabets. So anyway, that's just a thought of a way to do it. I mean, you know me. I feel like that your stitching and my designing, we're collaborators. You don't have to do it exactly the way I designed it. You can take that as kind of a jumping off point and figure out some interesting things that you can do on your own. Definitely when you get to the back stitching, that sort of gradation is something that we can talk about. And I think I'll go into that more next week. Because, I mean, there are people who are speedy stitchers who might get to that point before next week, but if so, you'll just have to wait. And speaking of that, I mean, Sampler September, yes, September 1st was Sunday. But you can really start this anytime. I mean, I hope that this whole sort of thing of making an event out of this is an inspiration and not something that you feel you have to do, or that if you didn't start on September 1st, you can't start, because none of that is true. I mean, you can pick this up anytime. Let's see. If you do go ahead and look at the second video, the second lesson in Hare and Basket, you'll also hear me mention about a chart correction. The chart that's in my Etsy store right now does not need that correction. It's been fixed. But I mention that because, frankly, there are several variations of this chart out there. And depending on which one you have, you might need that correction. Oh, and speaking of the different variations that are out there, the colors are the same, the design's the same, but the symbols might change. Because when I change the software that I use to develop my patterns and get them ready for publication, sometimes those symbols change. And so don't sweat it if your symbols look different than somebody else's. Interestingly enough, you know, I mentioned last week that I was participating in an online wholesale show, and Hare and Basket was my #1 seller. I was really, really surprised. I mean, considering that it's been around since 1996. But so you can ask for it in your local needlework shop now. Hopefully they'll be one of the ones that has picked it up. And if not, tell them to get in touch with me. I would love to send them some. Now, in my Etsy store, I only have the PDF version available, but in shops, you get a beautifully printed one. Let's see. I think that's all I need to say about that. I did add some more fabric to my Etsy store. Like I say, this works on any count linen, and with some adaptation, can work on any count Aida. Rita left a comment for me. Frankly, I can't remember whether it was Facebook or here on the channel, but she said, I get the feeling sometimes from various floss tubers that the only fabric to create on is linen. And then Jeannie, a different Jeannie, not me, said, unfortunately, I also get the impression that if you don't stitch on linen, your work is frowned upon. So this is my response to that. I certainly can't speak to what's on the mind of other floss tubers. I can only tell you what my point of view is. I didn't start my channel to be kind of a representation or a representative of every aspect of the counted cross-stitch industry. I started it to share the love I have and to share a little bit of the knowledge that I have about various aspects of cross-stitch and counted thread work. If I had started it with the idea that I was trying to represent all parts of our industry, I certainly would give equal time to Aida and linen and even weave. But frankly, I don't stitch on Aida, and I rarely stitch on even weave. I stitch on linen. That's where I choose to spend my stitching time. And I do that, frankly, because it's easiest for me. If somebody stitches on Aida and that's what they stitch on and they love it, that's fine. I embrace that. Where it sort of gets to me is the people who say that stitching on linen is harder than stitching on Aida, because that just isn't true. It really isn't harder. And I wish if I could sit down for just 30 minutes with any stitcher and just sit down with them and show them how to stitch on linen, and then after that they said, no, it's too hard, I don't want to do it, then fine and good. But there are the voices that say stitching on linen is hard are very, very loud and very, very dominant and very, very much all over the place. And that's what I kind of get tired of. I also stitch on linen because in doing so, it has opened up a whole world of other stitches. The cross stitch is our main thing. There's no doubt about that. But it's one of many counted thread stitches. And by stitching only on Aida, you're limiting yourself. Now, there's lots of stitches that you can do on Aida. Next week, not next week. When you look at the Hare and Basket lesson number 2, when I'm stitching the herringbone stitch, that can be done on most of the herringbone stitches can be done on Aida, but not all of them. And then as a side benefit, I just like the way it looks. So if I appear to be snobby about it, I apologize. That's so far away from how I truly feel that I really need to watch, I guess, how I sound about it and what I present about it. So at any rate, what I try to do in my episodes, this one included, is to share what I love about counted thread work. And I feel like that you've invited me into your home, you've invited me into your life, and I'm happy to share what I know. And I hope that in doing that, I never make you feel bad about what you're doing or not doing, what you're stitching on, what you're not stitching on. It just isn't there for me. So anyway, yeah, there's way too much negativity in our world as it is, and spending time with your needlework should be just pure pleasure. I mean, I used to joke that instead of calling it needlework, we should call it needle pleasure, but then, that gets into a whole different negative connotation of what we might mean by needle pleasure. Anyway, I think you get my drift, and I hope that wherever you are, that today you are stitching happy, and will stay safe until I see you next time. Bye.